The Grand Aurora Hotel in New York City was not yet fully open for the evening charity gala when Richard Andrews let go of his wife's arm. He did it with the casual dismissal of someone tossing an old coat onto the back seat of a car. The flashing lights of eager photographers were only a few feet away. Crystal flutes of expensive champagne floated by on silver trays carried by. Waiters and the Andrews family name shone brightly on the sponsor wall. Madeline felt the sudden absence of his touch first, followed swiftly by the crushing weight of the elite society's collective stares. Richard quickly adjusted the cuff of his pitch-black tuxedo, leaned his face toward hers, and whispered so quietly his lips barely moved, telling her to enter later because he did not want any confusion tonight. Madeline blinked slowly, the sharp sting of his words settling deep into her chest. She asked in a remarkably steady voice if her mere existence beside him was considered a confusion. Richard sighed with heavy impatience, warning her not to make a dramatic scene in front of the financial press. Before she could form a reply, a sickly sweet laugh sliced through the crisp New York air. Chloe appeared, draped in a shimmering gold gown, casually touching Richard's shoulder and murmuring that everyone was waiting for them. Madeline looked at Chloe's perfectly manicured fingers resting on the man who was still legally her husband, asking with an aching calmness exactly who everyone was. Chloe offered a triumphant, condescending smile, stating that it was the people who actually mattered. Richard did not correct Chloe, and that specific, cowardly silence felt exponentially worse than any shouted insult. Madeline stared at the man with whom she had shared 7 long years, 3 stressful apartment moves across Manhattan, 2 severe family crises, and countless early mornings where he returned, exhausted from Wall Street, only to find hot coffee waiting on the kitchen counter. He was the one who cowardly looked away first, pleading with her to understand that the company's image was currently too sensitive. He claimed Chloe needed to accompany him because she knew the investors, knew how to navigate the room, and knew exactly how to mingle perfectly. Madeline felt her throat tighten, but her voice remained crystal clear as she asked what that made her, perhaps just a pathetic mistake in the evening's decoration. Chloe feigned dramatic shock, placing a delicate hand over her chest and commenting on Madeline's supposed aggression, reminding Richard that she had explicitly warned him his wife would not take this well. Richard's jaw tightened as he snapped that it was enough, ordering Madeline to use a completely different entrance, sit wherever she pleased, and absolutely not seek him out for the remainder of the evening. Madeline took a deliberate step back, realizing out loud that he was effectively asking her to disappear from her own life. He replied without a single ounce of hesitation that it was only for a few hours. In that exact moment, a photographer's camera snapped entirely too close, immortalizing the tragic image of the isolated wife, while the powerful husband proudly offered his arm to his glamorous mistress. Richard's gesture was small, impeccably elegant, and profoundly cruel as he turned his body to allow Chloe to slip her arm through his. They walked past the arriving guests emerging from sleek Blacktown cars, completely ignoring the discreet security details and the whispering women hiding behind fine crystal glasses. A prominent real estate developer who had known Madeline since her very first charity dinner suddenly turned his face away, acting as though she were completely invisible. In high society New York, the elite certainly knew how to be exquisitely polite while burying someone alive. Madeline clearly heard Chloe project her voice just enough to inflict maximum pain without sounding unrefined, stating that a wife who cannot keep up the fast pace only slows down a brilliant man like Richard. Richard offered a half smile, driven not by genuine happiness but by pathetic social cowardice, as he prepared to walk the deep blue carpet of the grand event. Madeline looked at him one final time, calling his name and telling him that there was still time to reconsider this terrible choice. Chloe's grip on his arm tightened visibly. Richard glanced over his shoulder and coldly instructed Madeline to simply accept her place, before stepping into the blinding barrage of camera flashes with the other woman. Madeline stood completely frozen for several long seconds, utterly surrounded by the cold brilliance of the opulent lobby, the overwhelmingly expensive perfumes of passing heiresses, the sharp clicking of designer heels against polished marble, and the low, constant hum of the city, just beyond the heavy glass doors. She absolutely refused to cry, knowing perfectly well that shedding tears would only give Richard a highly convenient narrative to spin later to his friends, the overly emotional wife, the hysterical abandoned woman who simply lost control. Instead, she opened her small silver clutch, retrieved her mobile phone, and read a secure message that had arrived exactly 12 minutes prior. The message stated that the sender was in the private elevator, advising her not to enter just yet, because the final decision had to be entirely hers. The sender was identified only by the initials A.V. Madeleine closed her eyes for a fleeting moment, gathering up all the silent years she had spent desperately protecting a marriage that clearly no longer protected her, before typing a single sentence, confirming she had finally made her decision. A hotel security guard approached her with visible awkwardness, politely asking if Mrs. Andrews required any immediate assistance. Madeleine put her phone away, carefully adjusted the vintage silver brooch pinned to her deep blue evening gown, and confidently replied that he could tell the banquet staff her designated seat would not be used by the Andrews family tonight. Meanwhile, Richard strutted into the magnificent ballroom feeling as though he had just won an invisible war. The event was packed with legacy heirs, aggressive financial journalists, and powerful fund directors who controlled more destinies than the mayor of New York. His real estate group desperately needed this night's success for a massive expansion, specifically depending on a lucrative investment round supposed to be announced shortly. Chloe, gripping his arm like a property deed, whispered that he had done the right thing. Richard grabbed a flute of champagne, downing half of it in one gulp, and muttered that his wife did not need to understand their complex world. She just needed to stop getting in his way. Chloe tilted her head with immense satisfaction, purring that after tonight, absolutely no one would treat Madeleine as his equal, and they would all finally look at her instead. Richard did not offer a verbal response. A strange, heavy discomfort shifted deep within his chest, perhaps a tiny flicker of genuine guilt, or more likely just a lingering fear that Madeleine might still cause an embarrassing public scene. However, when he scanned the grand entrance of the ballroom and failed to spot her among the arriving crowds, he foolishly misinterpreted her profound silence as absolute, defeated surrender. The very first crack in his arrogant confidence appeared when the head maitre gracefully approached the main table. The maitre d' softly requested with rehearsed politeness that Richard wait, explaining that there had been a slight alteration in the seating arrangement for the Vance table. Richard frowned deeply and sharply protested that he was supposed to be seated directly with Arthur Vance, exactly as previously arranged for weeks. Maintaining a flawless professional smile, the staff member clarified that Mr. Vance had personally confirmed his exclusive guest list just a few minutes ago. Chloe gripped her gold clutch tightly, aggressively insisting there must be some ridiculous mistake, because Richard was the primary business partner of the entire evening. The maitre d' lowered his voice discreetly, expressing his understanding but firmly stating that the guest list was definitively closed. Richard felt a hot flush of humiliating anger rise to his cheeks as nearby executives blatantly pretended not to eavesdrop. In Richard's ruthless corporate world, being barred from a VIP table was never merely a logistical seating issue. It was a devastating public declaration of diminished worth. He aggressively demanded that the main event organizer be summoned immediately. The maitre politely bowed his head to comply. But before he could take a single step away, the ambient chatter of the massive ballroom suddenly shifted its texture. The noise did not increase in volume. Rather, it became sharply attentive, exactly like the collective hush that falls when a crowded room realizes someone of supreme importance has just arrived. Madeleine appeared at the massive main doors of the ballroom, walking without a single ounce of nervous hesitation. She had not bothered to change her deep blue dress, and she certainly did not need to. The elegant fabric draped over her figure with an effortless grace that Chloe's vast amounts of money could never possibly buy, because true elegance stemmed from inner posture, not a price tag. Walking calmly right beside Madeleine was Arthur Vance, a distinguished man with silver hair, an impeccably tailored suit, and the tranquil gaze of someone who never needed to raise his voice to command an entire room. He did not lead Madeline by the arm as if she were a newly acquired trophy. He walked alongside her with the profound respect of a man acknowledging an absolute intellectual equal. Madeline rested her hand lightly on his forearm, and the silver brooch on her chest beautifully caught the light of the magnificent crystal chandeliers. Several prominent guests instinctively stood up in respect. A seasoned financial journalist leaned over and urgently whispered to his colleague, desperately trying to figure out exactly when and how the notoriously quiet wife had become acquainted with the legendary Arthur Vance. Richard stood completely frozen, his half-empty champagne glass suspended awkwardly between his trembling fingers, while Chloe lost her carefully practiced smile for a terrifying second. Arthur smoothly navigated the crowded room, greeting only a select few individuals and measuring every single gesture with calculated precision. When they finally reached the vicinity of the main table, Arthur looked directly at Madeline and politely asked if the doctor preferred to take her seat immediately or resolve the unfortunate misunderstanding first. The prestigious title of doctor crashed over Richard's head like a shattering glass pane. Madeline locked eyes with her stunned husband. For the very first time that entire evening, the arrogant real estate mogul looked completely lost, utterly unsure of what facial expression he was supposed to maintain in front of his powerful peers. Chloe recovered with terrifying speed, letting out a short artificial laugh and declaring what a wonderfully pleasant surprise it was to discover Madeline had such an intimate friendship with Mr. Vance. The toxic venom in her tone was incredibly fine, meticulously wrapped in deceptive silk. Arthur did not even bother to glance in her general direction. Richard, however, aggressively took a step forward, demanding to know exactly what was going on. Madeline tilted her head gracefully, explaining that she was simply making an entrance through the main doors, pointing out that he was the one who had explicitly ordered her to find another path. Richard noticed several highly important faces turning toward their escalating confrontation, and he hissed at her not to turn the prestigious evening into a public spectacle. Madeline responded in a low tone, yet every single, carefully articulated word seemed to magically reach the surrounding tables. She calmly stated that she had not caused a spectacle when he abandoned her in the hotel lobby like garbage, noting that she had simply accepted the place he assigned her, which was completely outside of his table. Richard swallowed hard, desperately demanding to know why she was currently standing at Arthur Vance's exclusive table. Arthur finally spoke, his voice remarkably serene, declaring that she was there simply because tonight the table actually belonged to her. Chloe's face turned visibly pale beneath her heavy golden makeup. Richard desperately stared at the wealthy investor, arguing with forced respect that the situation made absolutely zero logical sense. Madeline then offered a smile completely devoid of joy, reminding Richard that he had dumped her at the entrance of the grand party and casually challenged him to try sitting at her table now without her explicit permission. The resulting silence was incredibly absolute, causing even the bustling waiters to momentarily freeze in their tracks. Richard opened his mouth, closed it again, and then let out a hollow laugh, desperately trying to reclaim the authority that was rapidly slipping through his fingers. He accused Madeline of using a mere acquaintance to provoke him. Arthur raised a silver eyebrow, asking with polite but razor-sharp precision if Richard truly believed they were merely acquaintances. Chloe attempted a desperate intervention, falsely explaining to Mr. Vance that Richard was under an enormous amount of corporate pressure and claiming that Madeline had been emotionally unstable ever since they discussed an impending separation. Madeline locked her blazing gaze onto Chloe, and for the very first time that night, her eyes revealed something far more dangerous than mere calmness. She repeated the word disgust with dripping irony. Chloe maintained her rigid smile, condescendingly begging Madeline not to make things more difficult, preaching that there are places people occupy out of love and places they must vacate out of dignity. Madeline swiftly agreed with the sentiment, noting that this was exactly why Chloe should have stayed at her own home tonight. A loud wave of excited murmurs immediately rippled across the opulent ballroom. Richard forcefully grabbed Chloe's arm, not out of any chivalrous desire to protect her, but simply to physically stop her from speaking another word finally understanding that a powerful current was dragging him under the surface. Arthur discreetly pulled out a luxurious velvet chair for Madeline, but she intentionally remained standing. That tiny, deliberate refusal wounded Richard more deeply than any spoken insult, as she was actively rejecting comfort until she finished the necessary execution. Madeline spoke again, her voice completely stripped of any apparent rage, reminding Richard that for 7 years she had listened to him preach that their marriage was a true partnership. She reminded him of the 3 sleepless nights she spent reorganizing complex financial reports that he never even bothered to read, when his very first business expansion nearly collapsed. She continued her relentless truth-telling, recalling how she forced herself to smile for family photographs even after his snobbish mother had openly called her a lackluster bride. She pointed out that when Chloe began regularly attending intimate business dinners, as if her presence were absolutely indispensable, she had remained quiet, foolishly hoping that Richard's character would eventually speak louder than her own wounded pride. Richard cast his eyes downward for a microscopic fraction of a second. Chloe dramatically whispered a question, asking the surrounding crowd if this was supposed to be emotional blackmail. Madeline fired back instantly, stating that true blackmail was threatening to leak vicious lies to the New York press if she refused to quietly exit through the back door, noting that Chloe understood that shady tactic far better than anyone else. The mistress's face froze in sheer panic. It was incredibly fast, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, but Arthur Vance saw it clearly, and so did Madeline. Richard suddenly felt the expensive carpet shift dangerously beneath his polished Italian shoes. He turned his head and demanded to know exactly what press leaks they were talking about. Chloe let out a nervous laugh that completely failed to find any sympathetic support in the room, accusing Madeline of trying to separate them simply because she could not accept defeat. Madeline ignored the outburst, casually opening her silver clutch and withdrawing a single pristine white business card bearing the embossed silver logo of Vance Capital. She gently placed it flat on the elegant table, announcing that she had not come to argue about pathetic adultery. Madeline declared that adultery was far too small a topic for such an important evening, revealing she was actually there to discuss corporate trust, market reputation, and severe financial risk. Richard stared at the small card as if it were a venomous snake about to strike him. He demanded to know exactly how long she had possessed the authority to speak on behalf of Vance Capital. Arthur answered the question for her, stating smoothly that she had been doing so since long before the Andrews Group ever became attractive again to any serious Wall Street investor. The psychological blow was remarkably clean. There was absolutely no screaming, no vulgar humiliation, just cold, unyielding reality. Richard's face flushed deep crimson before draining to a sickly pale white, while Chloe's comforting hand hovered uselessly. Madeline finally took her seat, leaving the chair right next to her completely empty, effectively establishing an uncrossable border between her new life and Richard's shattered ego. Richard instinctively tried to step closer, but the matron suddenly reappeared, blocking his path with a firm, highly polished gesture, officially informing Mr. Andrews that his table had indeed been relocated. The word relocated echoed in Richard's mind like a fatal plunge from a skyscraper. Several wealthy guests actively averted their eyes, attempting to mask their cruel delight at witnessing the spectacular downfall of a peer. The New York elite absolutely never forgave weakness. They only applauded when destruction was beautifully dressed. Richard stared at his wife, harboring a terrifying question he still lacked the courage to ask aloud. Madeline easily read the unasked question in his desperate eyes. He was silently begging to know who she really was, and felt a sudden, ancient wave of profound sadness. It was tragically clear that he only ever became interested in discovering her true identity when his own powerful position was directly threatened. Arthur leaned in closer and softly murmured that they could still easily leave the venue right now if she wished. Madeline took a slow, grounding breath and politely declined, stating that Richard absolutely needed to hear the upcoming toast from the main stage. The Grand Master of Ceremonies loudly announced that Arthur Vance would now deliver the evening's official opening remarks. Richard remained awkwardly standing between two fully occupied tables, stranded without a seat, with Chloe beside him. Arthur ascended the grand stage with the absolute calm of a man who possessed nothing left to prove to anyone. Madeline remained seated, with her hands neatly folded in her lap, feeling her heart rhythmically beating beneath the silver vintage brooch. Richard simply could not stop staring at her from across the room. Chloe was now frantically whispering into her mobile phone, desperately trying to discover which insider had leaked the seating changes, entirely oblivious to the fact that her sheer anxiety was her very first genuine confession. The microphone popped softly as Arthur began his speech, dedicating the evening to solid business partnerships and reminding the elite crowd that true success in American business is not sustained by old money, beautiful skyscrapers, or staged photographs, but strictly by unwavering trust. Arthur Vance announced clearly from the stage that before any new investments were confirmed, his firm would conduct a rigorous final review of all corporate groups attempting to associate their brand with Vance Capital. A collective gasp swept through the massive ballroom. Richard took a stumbling step backward, looking exactly like a condemned man who had just received a devastating sentence without hearing the full verdict. Madeline gracefully lifted her crystal goblet of sparkling water, not champagne, and offered a silent, solitary toast across the room. The night of reckoning was only just beginning. The following morning, New York City woke up beneath a heavy blanket of gray clouds that made the towering glass buildings of Wall Street look like sealed containers holding incredibly expensive secrets. Richard had not slept a single minute. He had spent the entire night pacing the hardwood floors of his sprawling Upper East Side penthouse, still wearing his wrinkled dress shirt with a loosened silk tie, his eyes bloodshot from endlessly replaying every excruciating detail of the disastrous gala. Arthur Vance had spoken publicly of a final review, Madeline had confidently sat at his exclusive table, and the hotel staff had treated Richard like an unwanted interloper. It was not merely humiliating. It was catastrophically dangerous for his entire corporate empire. When his mobile phone vibrated harshly against the marble counter for the 7th time, he finally answered without bothering to check the caller ID. On the other end of the line, his mother, Claire's voice snapped with dry, terrifying authority, demanding an immediate explanation for the previous night's shocking events. Claire demanded to know exactly why his supposedly irrelevant wife had paraded around as the undisputed queen of the evening alongside the one man who held the absolute power to completely destroy their corporate expansion. Richard pinched the bridge of his nose, admitting with deep exhaustion that he had absolutely no idea. His mother coldly instructed him to find out immediately, warning him to uncover the truth before the relentless financial newspapers did it for him. He slowly turned his gaze toward the closed wooden door of Madeline's bedroom, a room she had not emerged from since returning late the previous night. For the very first time in 7 years, the profound silence echoing inside their luxurious home did not feel like submissive obedience. It felt like a heavy, definitive, and permanent absence. Chloe arrived shortly before 8 o'clock in the morning, wearing a stark white designer outfit, oversized dark sunglasses that were entirely ridiculous for an indoor hallway, and a pungent perfume that aggressively invaded the penthouse before she even spoke. The building's private security had hesitated to let her use the VIP elevator, but Richard had impulsively authorized her entry, foolishly hoping her familiar presence might somehow restore a shred of normalcy to the chaotic life he had ruined. She barged into the penthouse without waiting for a formal invitation, carelessly tossing her expensive handbag onto the pristine linen sofa. She urgently announced that the financial press was already sniffing around, noting that 2 prominent business columnists had called her directly to ask if Madeline was secretly employed by Vance Capital. Richard turned around incredibly slowly, asking her exactly what she had told the inquisitive reporters. Chloe removed her massive sunglasses, revealing tightly strained eyes, and claimed she told them the idea was utterly absurd. She prosaically stated she reinforced the narrative that Madeline had always been nothing more than a quiet housewife and a social companion. Richard felt a sudden, sharp pang of intense discomfort in his chest, quietly correcting her by stating that Madeline had never actually been just a housewife. Chloe blinked in genuine surprise at his unexpected defense. Richard realized his mistake far too late, clumsily attempting to backtrack by saying his wife simply took care of her own personal matters. Chloe stepped uncomfortably close, tapping his chest with her manicured fingers, demanding he choose a single narrative. Chloe astutely pointed out that Madeline had to be either entirely irrelevant or highly dangerous, warning him that she simply could not be both at the same time. The observation was entirely too intelligent to offer any real comfort. Richard stared deeply into her eyes and, for the very first time, realized that Chloe was not actually afraid of the spreading lies. She was only terrified of losing her tight grip on controlling them. Madeline finally emerged into the living room closer to 10 o'clock, accompanied only by a small gray suitcase and the silent, towering dignity of a woman who no longer needed to ask for permission to move around her own home. The sight of the mistress lounging casually on her sofa with a cup of coffee struck Madeline with a cold, almost physical blow. Madeline refused to grant them the sick satisfaction of a visible emotional reaction, calmly announcing that she had merely come to collect her personal identification documents and a few specific digital files from her private computer. She placed her suitcase gently near the heavy oak door. Richard immediately jumped to his feet, declaring with desperate urgency that they absolutely needed to sit down and talk. Madeline shifted her gaze from Chloe back to him, flatly questioning if he meant just the two of them. Chloe offered a sickeningly sweet, entirely fake smile, suggesting it was best she stayed to act as a witness after Madeline's theatrical performance the night before. Madeline kept her voice perfectly level, asking if Chloe intended to act as a witness or the lead scriptwriter for their pathetic drama. Richard aggressively ran a hand through his messy hair, shouting for everyone to stop, and demanded to know exactly what kind of relationship Madeline had with Arthur Vance. Madeline slowly walked down the long hallway, calling back over her shoulder that it was entirely built on professional respect. Richard let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh, asking when she supposedly stopped being just a smiling prop. Madeline answered that it started long before he foolishly decided her only value was looking pretty in family photographs. Chloe slammed her coffee cup onto the glass table with tightly controlled fury, calling the entire situation ridiculous and arguing that if it were true, Madeline would never have hidden such a prestigious career from her own loving husband. Madeline simply stated that her husband never bothered to ask who she was when the cameras were off. Madeline's private office was located at the very end of the hallway, a small room Richard rarely entered because he arrogantly considered it far too insignificant for any matters of real importance. Inside, there was a simple light oak desk, thick volumes on economic strategy, anonymously bound risk reports, and an old framed photograph of Madeline with her late father in Montauk, taken right before his sudden illness devoured the boutique consulting firm she had fought to keep alive. The moment she pushed the heavy door open, Madeline instantly recognized that something was terribly wrong. The bottom drawer of her filing cabinet was slightly ajar. A blue folder that strictly belonged inside was resting carelessly on the desk, and her silver laptop had been visibly pushed a few inches to the left. To an ordinary observer, these tiny shifts would mean absolutely nothing, but to Madeline, a woman intimately acquainted with the precise geometry of her own silent world, it screamed of deliberate invasion. Richard suddenly loomed in the doorway behind her, nervously asking what was wrong. She took a very slow, highly measured breath and flatly stated that someone had been digging through her personal sanctuary. Chloe immediately materialized in the hallway, her eyes darting around far too quickly, and weakly suggested that perhaps the housekeeper had been overzealous with her dusting. Madeline carefully opened the compromised blue folder, immediately noticing that a highly specific envelope was missing. It was not her most critical piece of evidence, but its absence was more than enough to clearly broadcast the thief's malicious intention. Madeline calmly noted that the housekeeper did not possess the complicated numerical passcode to unlock that specific bottom drawer. Richard instinctively shot a suspicious look at Chloe, who aggressively raised her chin, demanding to know exactly what Madeline was baselessly insinuating. Madeline closed the folder with a soft snap, replying that she was not insinuating anything just yet, but was merely observing how aggressively Chloe reacted before even being formally accused of a crime. Richard impatiently stepped past his wife into the small room, his eyes catching sight of the scattered reports on the desk, and he snatched one up before Madeline could physically stop him. The pages were filled with complex risk projections, detailed real estate asset valuations, and corporate reputation metrics that looked dangerously similar to his own company's internal data. A toxic mixture of raw fear, the crushing humiliation from the previous night, and the echoing demands of his mother's phone call instantly fused together in Richard's mind, creating a wildly inaccurate conclusion. He aggressively waved the document, furiously accusing Madeline of actively collecting confidential corporate intelligence from the Andrews Group to secretly hand over to Vance Capital. The heavy accusation dropped like an anvil, and for a fleeting second, Madeline looked physically smaller, not weak, but profoundly wounded by his absolute lack of faith. She asked in a near whisper if he genuinely believed she was capable of such profound betrayal. Richard furiously tapped the paper, shouting that he was looking right at the undeniable proof. Madeline let out a hollow laugh, pointing out that he was only seeing paper, interpreting everything else to fit his highly convenient victim narrative. Chloe sauntered into the small office with agonizingly slow, calculated steps, placing a comforting hand on Richard's arm and warning him to be incredibly careful, because the files could represent a massive corporate espionage leak. Madeline stared directly into the mistress's eyes, noting aloud that Chloe seemed remarkably eager to officially name a crime. Richard spun back to his wife, threatening that if any of those files left the apartment, he would forcefully prosecute her for corporate treason. Madeline stepped forward and firmly yanked the report right out of his hands, fiercely reminding him that he had already treated their sacred marriage vows as entirely disposable, and ordered him not to pretend he suddenly knew how to fiercely protect anything of real value. Richard's face hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. Madeline calmly opened another drawer, retrieving a small encrypted external hard drive and several highly personal folders, meticulously packing them into her gray suitcase with remarkably precise, unhurried movements. Chloe wandered over to the bookshelf, pretending to examine the titles like a bored tourist in a museum, throwing out a snide comment about how much paperwork there was for someone who always claimed to hate the complex business world. Madeline completely ignored the bait. Richard, however, remained obsessively fixated on the terrifying concept of corporate treason. He demanded to know why she had never told him about her employment with Vance Capital if it was truly legitimate. Madeline zipped her suitcase, reminding him that whenever she tried to share her strategic insights, he condescendingly told her she was entirely too emotionally fragile to comprehend hard-hitting negotiations. Richard briefly seemed to remember those exact conversations, but he almost instantly banished the uncomfortable memory, weakly arguing that it was merely a single, thoughtless phrase, and coldly corrected him, stating it was never just a phrase, but an endless, suffocating pattern of dismissal. Chloe let out an exaggerated sigh, attempting to manipulate Richard by claiming Madeline was viciously trying to blame him for her own massive web of deceit. Madeline grabbed the sturdy handle of her suitcase, paused right next to the mistress, and delivered a devastatingly calm blow. She defined true manipulation as sneaking into another woman's private office, stealing a single envelope from a locked drawer, and eagerly waiting for the husband to discover the remaining planted evidence at the perfectly orchestrated moment. Chloe's heavily bronzed face drained of all color for half a second. Richard finally noticed the slip, but the tragic reality was that his fragile ego still desperately refused to process the implication. Right before Madeline could cross the threshold, Richard's phone erupted with a loud ringtone. The caller ID flashed the name Oliver, the incredibly anxious chief financial officer of the Andrews Group. Richard absent-mindedly answered the call on speakerphone, allowing Oliver's panicked voice to flood the tense office. The CFO frantically reported that a notorious financial gossip portal had just published A blind item suggesting the CEO's wife was seen in a highly intimate embrace with Arthur Vance, implying that romantic favors were actively influencing the massive investment review. Madeline closed her eyes in disgust, while Chloe dramatically gasped in fake horror. Richard stood frozen like a classical statue, as Oliver continued reading the devastating headline, warning that the corporate board of directors was demanding a comprehensive public response by the end of the business day. Richard abruptly ended the call without even bothering to say goodbye. The subsequent silence in the room was so incredibly thick that the distant, muffled sirens from the busy New York streets below felt as though they belonged to an entirely different universe. He slowly turned his gaze back to Madeline, his eyes brimming with heavy accusation long before his mouth ever formed the actual words. He aggressively asked if she had secretly spoken to the sleazy journalists. Madeline let out a low, utterly incredulous laugh, marveling at the sheer audacity of his profoundly broken logic. She pointed out the incredible irony that she had just been publicly branded as the deceitful mistress of a man who treated her with more basic human decency than her own husband, yet Richard's very first instinct was to desperately accuse her of orchestrating the smear campaign. Chloe quickly placed a reassuring hand on his forearm, whispering toxic poison into his ear, suggesting Madeline had the perfect motive to seek vicious revenge for her public humiliation at the grand gala. Madeline stared intensely at Chloe's hand resting on Richard's arm, calmly stating that she also had every motive in the world to scream hysterically in the hotel lobby the night before, but she had ultimately chosen grace over chaos. Richard remained completely silent, deeply struck by the undeniable truth of her powerful statement. As suspicion surrounding the scandal continued to grow, Chloe tried to pressure Madeline into publicly denying any conflict of interest in order to protect the company's reputation and financial stability. Madeline firmly refused to lie for a corporate image that Richard's own actions had damaged. When Richard demanded explanations about her relationship with the investor and questioned her loyalty, Madeline calmly pointed out that nothing she ever did had been enough for him. She admitted she was not enjoying the crisis, but was exhausted after spending 7 years sacrificing herself to protect his image and ambitions. Chloe mocked her, but Madeline responded by exposing Chloe's habit of presenting herself as the solution to problems she had helped create. When Richard attempted to stop her from leaving and insisted on reviewing her files, she simply refused, making it clear that his control over her life was finally over. As Madeline prepared to leave the penthouse for good, Richard briefly reached for her suitcase, only to realize how far he had fallen and how much damage he had caused. Seeing himself through her eyes, he finally recognized the reality of a husband trying to control a woman he had repeatedly failed and distrusted. Madeline walked away without looking back, understanding that healing meant never shrinking herself to fit someone else's broken expectations. As the elevator carried her toward the streets of New York, she reflected on a lesson many people learn too late. True love should never require the sacrifice of one's identity, dignity, or dreams. A relationship that demands constant self-erasure becomes a prison rather than a refuge, and reclaiming one's voice is not selfishness, but a courageous return to the person one was always meant to be.